So today my guest is Alan Hertz, who has been teaching courses on the history of London for over 40 years. While he may sound like a North American man, he described himself as from London, and hopefully this is a fascinating insight into all of the treasures that London has to offer. Also, Alan has a fantastic podcast called Side Streets, which goes all into the history and geography of the streets of the great city of London. Enjoy. Alan, thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you in Ye Olde Mitre, a historically significant pub. But before that,
Oh, okay.
what is the most historically interesting street in London?
Yeah, I'm a ex-professor, so I'm going to dodge that question. And I'm going to answer by talking about a kind of street.
Okay.
And it's the kind that's not usually visited by tourists, and I think not usually noticed even by the people who walk down it every day. And these are streets on the edge of the ancient city.
Okay.
So on the podcast in the first year, I had an episode about Alley Street, which ran down from where we worked together several years ago, down from Commercial Road to the walls of the city. And it's completely nondescript now. People walk down it and wouldn't notice, because there's nothing to notice, the rich past that they're walking through. But there were once whorehouses there. There were once hospitals there. There were once theaters there. There were once chapels of obscure Protestant sects there. There was so much going on that street because it was just beyond the area of the city that was very heavily regulated. So things that people wanted access to, but things that the authorities didn't entirely trust or approve of, tended to congregate in places like that.
Yeah.
So Baptists are not welcome in the city of London. In the 17th century, there are Baptists in the city of London. They don't want to have to go miles and miles to church on a Sunday. They go just beyond the city authorities' jurisdiction, and there's a Baptist chapel.
And so that in the ancient London, or not ancient London, but when are we talking here?
Early modern period. Okay. Alley Street actually has a very old history. It's been on the map since the first map, which turned up in the middle of the 16th century, middle 1500s.
Really? Oh, that's the first maps we have.
And it's probably even older than that, or a lot older than that. But it was a kind of country lane. And then over the hundreds of years of the early modern period, 1550 to say 1800, it's gradually completely urbanized.
Is a lot of what we know about London before the 1500s from either architecture, i.e. you can see the Roman wall, or from deeds or some random pieces of...
Before the 1500s, only a few buildings and fragments of buildings survived.
Really?
Well, the fire burned almost everything in 1666. And London has been a building site for 400 years. So the things that didn't burn were bombed by the Germans, or even more likely than bombed by the Germans, torn down by the Victorians.
Really?
And didn't survive. So if you're looking at the medieval history of London, your primary sources are documentary. They're legal deeds and things of that kind.
Is there anything that survives from medieval London?
The Tower of London, St. Bartholomew the Great's Church, which is just up here, Westminster Hall in Westminster, and others, but not enough others to give you a real sense. And those are not typical buildings.
No,
those are,
yeah. There's no sort of general buildings like... what's the oldest pub?
The Hoop and Grapes in Aldgate.
Oh, that is the oldest pub.
They say the oldest surviving building that isn't a church or a fortress in the city of London.
Really?
Because the fire did not burn east. It almost entirely burned west from where it started near London Bridge. So the area to the east of London Bridge survived better.
Yeah.
And Hoop and Grapes is right out at the eastern edge, and it's been rebuilt over the years. If you go in, you're not seeing a medieval interior, but there are timbers there structurally. A significant part of it goes back, I think, to the 1400s. I'd have to check that, but I think that's right.
And then you have the Roman wall that you can still see from...
Fragments of it.
Yeah. And that's how early is that?
Beginning of the 2nd century AD, but a lot of places what you're looking at is medieval rebuilding of the Roman wall. If we were in front of it, I could show you the difference between Roman building, which is very good, and medieval building, which isn't nearly as good.
Yeah.
You can see it quite clearly on the wall when the Roman bits are visible, but a lot of them are underground.
And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? You go into weird car parks in Moorgate and there's a Roman wall that's been it's there, but it's...
Well, when I started doing this, sort of specializing in teaching the history of London, which was over 30 years ago now, I would say that we don't know much about Roman London because London has not moved. And so the archaeology is underneath the most expensive real estate in the world, give or take a bit. And that means the archaeologists don't get much of a chance to work it. When a new building goes up, the developers might give them a couple of weeks in order to get planning permission, but it's like emergency archaeology. That's no longer true. So much rebuilding done in the city in the last 30 years that London is now one of the most excavated Roman sites in the world. I read somewhere, I'm not sure it's true, that a larger percentage of Roman London has been excavated than Roman Rome has been excavated. But I wouldn't trust that. I would want to fact check it myself before I put it on a podcast. But that's up to you.
That is interesting. Well, that's something I find interesting as well, where you have all these European cities that have protected sight lines, etc. So we have the St. Paul's sight lines.
Right.
Are there others in London as well?
Yes, mostly out where I live in Richmond.
Oh, really?
Where Richmond got very organized very early to protect its heritage and, interestingly, defined its heritage, at least in part, in terms of viewpoints.
Okay.
So if you walk up Richmond Hill from the town toward the main entrance to Richmond Park, there's a famous view looking down the Thames.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And that has been legally protected longer than the views of St. Paul's have been legally protected. It's been legally protected for, I think, about 120 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And Richmond has its own flood control. Petersham Meadows by the Thames, which is a floodplain going back forever. And it's been protected since, I think, 1902 or 1903, and was the first of that kind of legislation anywhere in England. And because we don't know what else to do with it, the borough of Richmond has a borough herd of cows.
Yeah. It's a nice walk down.
I think there are 5 of them. You walk through Petersham Meadow, and there are these beasts. Yeah. No other borough can lay claim to beasts.
Yeah, that is interesting but other cities have it. Is it Rome? You can't build higher than...
Oh, other, yeah. But even that has changed. When I got here, before you were born, I imagine, when I got here, NatWest Tower, Tower 42 now, that was the only building that I would call a skyscraper in the city. The skyline was, with that shocking exception, something that somebody in Christopher Wren's time would recognize. The buildings were about the same height. His church steeples stuck up. They were still visible from across the river. when London got its own mayor, that changed quite suddenly.
Really?
Ken Livingstone, who might have been socialist in other respects, was a friend to property developers. Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, was an even greater friend of property developers, and they began to allow tall building in the city. The view of St. Paul's from the west, from Westminster Bridge and Waterloo Bridge, was protected, which meant that those buildings were all built to the east and the northeast of St. Paul.
And they are slightly like the cheese grater Leadenhall building that's slanted so that you can still see it from one particular angle.
You may be right. I don't know. If so, I've never found that angle.
So before we move on, actually, I really want to touch on where we are today. So we are in Ye Olde Mitre.
We are.
Would you call this Chancery Lane or Hatton Garden?
We're between Hatton Garden and Ely Place. The street outside is called Hatton Passage, I think.
Okay.
But as you will have noticed, it's so small that if they didn't put a sign on the pavement outside, you'd miss it. You'd walk by it.
Well, this is I'd say one of the coolest pubs in London in terms of you feel like you're in a Sherlock Holmes book.
Extraordinarily inaccessible. Okay. There are a lot of, I won't say lies, I won't even say urban myths, but questionable stories about this pub.
Right. Set them straight out.
Which way are we pointing? That way, Ely Place. Going back to the 1200s is the London home of the Bishops of Ely.
Yeah.
And the Bishops of Ely are among the most powerful people in England. You might think of a bishop as a spiritual leader now, but your normal Bishop of Ely was one of the closest advisors to the king. He normally had his own army. He had substantial troops to contribute to the king's wars, and he often led them himself. He was a major player in national politics. He also was one of, I think, 3, maybe 4 bishops who had special chartered privileges going back even before the Norman conquest. And one of his privileges was that his lands were not subject to judicial control by local sheriffs.
Right.
So where we are sitting was legally Ely.
Right. Not London.
Like an embassy today, right, where the Chinese embassy, this pub was legally not
of London,
subject to the jurisdiction of the City of London or the local authorities outside the walls. It was legally Ely, which is, 110, 120 miles away. Days ride until the modern world. And it would seem that the bishops began to take advantage of this anomaly. The word Godfather has a double meaning, but we're straying into what might be urban myth. It's hard to tell how far this went.
Let's stray further. I like urban myth.
We're right beside High Holborn, which is one of the main roads out of London to the west. If you're a footpad, that is to say, a street robber without a horse, not a highwayman, but a highwayman on foot, this is a really good spot.
Right, because you're out of they can't get
you can bop out there, you can rob somebody, you can bop back in here, and you can't be arrested on a local warrant. A local magistrate has no jurisdiction here. If you're going to be arrested, your victim has to go up to Ely and get the magistrate to swear out a warrant. And of course, the magistrate is the bishop. Ely is a cathedral town. It's run by the bishop. The bishops seem to have started building houses on their property and renting them to people who would pay substantially over the London market rent for this kind of legal protection.
Yeah.
So godfathers, perhaps, in more senses in the Francis Ford Coppola sense, as well as the spiritual sense, goes that way on the passage, and you get to Hatton Garden, which is a street of jewelry shops.
Yeah.
And there have been jewelry shops there since the 1600s. Okay, imagine what's going on in the snug where we're sitting now.
You can run there.
I will be the footpad.
Yeah.
And I've grabbed a bunch of necklaces and things off people traveling on Holborn, and I've dashed in here, and I've come in here with my swag, and you're a jeweler from Hatton Garden. You turn up, you buy me a pint or two. We do a bit of business together. If that victim actually takes the trouble of going to Ely, and if the bishop, for some weird reason, grants a warrant for the arrest of his tenant, all of that seems kind of unlikely. And he gets back here with the warrant. It's going to have taken him a week, maybe longer. Yeah. And by then, you've gone the 50 meters to your workshop on Hatton Garden, and the gold has been melted down, and the stones have been reset, and the evidence of the theft is gone. It's hard to tell where that story stops being true for sure and becomes increasingly unlikely. But there are records of people in the 18th century people trying to arrest people in this pub and not being able to do so.
What is a mitre, by the way? The old mitre?
A mitre is a bishop's hat. If you think of the chess piece, the traditional chess piece, that the top of it is.
So we're in the old bishop's hat.
Yeah, there's one stuck on the wall outside. What if?
Is there?
Yeah, you'll be able to see one.
It is a very interesting one, and for those who are listening, just to describe it quickly, you are literally stuck in between two roads, and you can only come in through a 4-foot wide passage from either side.
Yeah, and they put tables up to make sure it's really narrow.
Yeah. And carry on.
Well, history of the pub. The date outside says 1546, and I think that's purely a guess.
Oh, really?
Nobody's sure. It seems to have been created more or less when the bishop lost some of his land to the Hatton family. Sir Christopher Hatton was one of Queen Elizabeth I's favorite people.
Right.
And I pointed out to you a tree trunk, which is embedded in the wall at the front of the pub. She and Sir Christopher supposedly danced around it as a maypole on May 1st of some day in the 1540s. Sir Christopher was looking for a London base. He was a very important courtier. If you're a courtier, you have to have a substantial London home. And Elizabeth forced the bishops of Ely. She was really prepared to use muscle for Sir Christopher. She forced the bishops to give him part of the ancient manor that they used to have, the land in Hatton Garden as well. And the pub seems to date from then, not this building.
Right.
And it seems to have been a pub for the servants of the two households. The building we're in dates from the 1770s.
Okay.
And dates from the moment when the bishops seem to have stopped growing fruit and vegetables on their land.
Okay.
Ely Place was so famous for strawberries that they turn up in Shakespeare.
Oh, really? Richard
III is in a bad mood one day. Richard III is often in a bad mood. And he's getting ready to arrest his best friend. And he wants to be cheered up. So he says to the Bishop of Ely, who does not otherwise have a part in the play, "Go get me some of your strawberries." And the bishop says, "Yes, my lord. It's a part you get, I guess, at the beginning of your career." The bishop says, Yes, my lord. Off he goes and comes back sometime later with a punnet of these famous strawberries.
Really place.
Henry VIII was entertained here by the bishops.
In the pub.
With Catherine of Aragon, not in the pub, at the hall in the Bishop's Hall in Ely Place.
Does that still exist?
No.
No.
I'll get to that. I'll get to what remains in a second. And it seems like half a zoo was killed to feed him and Catherine. And it would seem that the marriage was already falling apart because accounts of that feast have them eating in separate rooms. He did not eat with his wife. He ate separately.
Right.
So we're on the verge of trouble. Right, Ely Place.
Yeah, how much is left of that now?
If you don't know, you're in for a treat. You asked what medieval buildings survive, and I held back on this.
Laid me out.
The secular buildings are almost entirely gone. The Bishop's Palace was this complex of buildings. It would have looked like an Oxford College or a Cambridge College. There are fragments of a cloister, but the bishop's private chapel still survives. It goes back to the 1200s. It might be the most beautiful church in the city of London. It certainly has to be up there in the top few. It's lined with memorials to the Roman Catholic martyrs at the Reformation because it's unique in one respect. It was built as a Roman Catholic church in the 1200s. It became a Church of England church at the Reformation in the 1530s. But late in the 19th century, a group of nuns moved into houses on Ely Place, and they petitioned the Bishop of London to allow them to use it as their chapel. And the bishop agreed. So it's the only church in London which began life as a Roman Catholic church, became a Protestant church at the Reformation, and has been, as it says on the door, returned to the true faith.
Right.
So it's now Roman Catholic again, which is why there are these statues in stained glass commemorating the Catholic martyrs, many of whom were killed at Smithfield, just up the road.
Okay.
So it is convenient.
That's one of the oldest buildings. But if, as you said, most of London has been somewhat built upon or changed and is in a constant state of change, if you wanted to go to a part of London which has been the least changed, where would I go?
You warned me about this. This is such a tricky question. No part of London is unchanged. And to me, that's the exciting thing. We're here with a 13th century building just over there. We're in an 18th century building built on top of a 16th century building. There are modern buildings that way. I don't think there's anything older. There are other 18th century buildings in the area. If you can use your mind's eye, you can walk around a medieval streetscape, because the oldest maps that show this area at all show the streets in exactly where they are now.
Really?
The streets have been where they are for 500 years. But the buildings have been transformed. If the fire didn't get them,
bombs did.
Development got them, bombs got them, they got God. There are all sorts of online sources to find out what it is you would see if you were looking at this place 100, 200, 300 years ago. There's a guy with a YouTube channel called London Through Time. and he picks a location, and he's a really good video editor, and he does still pictures of it as it is now, and then he scrolls back to historic pictures and historic pictures as far back as he can go. And that's really clever. You really get a sense of, you really get a sense of what used to be, what you're staring at.
And I think obviously you're from North America. I remember I lived in Seattle for a bit.
I know you did.
And I think London has had a tube longer than Seattle has existed in its city status. I think it's 1869.
Yeah, that's about right. 1863 for the underground.
The tube, which is...
Not the tube, the underground.
The underground. Yeah.
Shall I make the distinction for your listener?
Please, for my brother, who was a big tube.
Yeah, he wouldn't have been happy with you at all. The underground is the first lines built before tunneling machines developed. And Aldgate East, where we used to work together, is a good example of what that kind of line looks like. They would dig a trench and then cover it with cement.
Style, yeah.
Yeah. So you've actually got Whitechapel High Road on top of the station. And nothing has fallen through yet. It seems to work. But starting in the 1890s, technology was developed that could actually drill tunnels through London clay. There's a statue of the inventor, Mr. Greathead, in front on the plaza in front of the bank.
Yeah, really?
Next to the Duke of Wellington. He's got a statue for inventing the tunneling machine, and that made the Northern Line and the Piccadilly Line and the Central Line. That made them possible. So people who care call those deep lines the tube, and they call the earlier lines, the shallow lines, the underground.
Well, I'd say my favourite station of all the underground would be the Baker Street, which has been Hammersmith and City line, I think it is,
exactly.
The Circle line, and you honestly do feel like you're...
It's been restored to something that resembles, not exactly resembles, but something pretty close to what it was when it opened in 1863.
Yeah.
It would have had steam trains.
Yeah, that's the mad thing.
In 1863. And if you can visualize that station, there are these weird half oval recesses along the walls.
The light, yeah.
Well, now they're used for lighting, but they were originally for ventilation to get the smoke and the steam out from the station before people suffocated. And on the early trains, there were classes: first class tickets, second class tickets, third class tickets, and the third class tickets were closest to the engine. You might think it's cool to be closest to the engine, but that's because you're a 6-year-old boy at heart. In practice, you don't want to be close to the engine because that's where you get covered with filth and where you can't breathe. So those were the cheapest seats in the house.
Yeah, there's a lot. You could do a whole episode on London transport, etc., etc.
The first tube cars on the Northern Line, which was the earliest of the deep lines, didn't have windows because the designers thought, why should we spend money on windows? There's nothing to see. You're underground. And people panicked. You load them into this enclosed box and you shunt them along, and people freaked out. So they had to take those cars out of service and bring cars with windows into service. But then the problem is there's still nothing to see. So they actually installed lighting along the tunnels of the Northern Line so that people could look out of the unnecessary windows and have unnecessary lights to look at, all to keep them from panicking.
So you don't feel like you're in a coffin.
Right.
Well, fair enough.
You can see one of those cars, at least you used to be able to, at the London Transport Museum. They actually have.
Maybe I'll take that.
And it's really claustrophobic. You can see why people freaked out.
So the other one I'll get on to is when London was bombed. Where was the area where we lost maybe the most historical significance?
Okay, we can have a couple of bombing raids here. The first one, and I think we're talking about September 1940. I would need to be fact-checked again. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think
do your own research on this one. Do your own research. This is just Alan's off the hip, okay? Do not take it verbatim. Alan.
I think it was the first night where the gasworks were hit in Beckton.
Okay.
Beckton is down the river.
End of the DLR, yeah.
And one of the largest industrial premises in London was there, and it converted coal into liquid form to be piped through the streets for street lighting. And that was hit, I think, the first night of the Blitz, and the explosion was seen in Paris.
Really? Oh, my God.
So that must have been a wake-up call to Londoners. The most famous night of the Blitz is December 29th, 1940, and that's the so-called Second Great Fire. And that was, if not the first night of the Baedeker raids, an early night of the Baedeker raids. I have so many things to explain at once now. I don't know where to go first. Right. I'll do Baedeker first. Hitler, apparently personally, decided that the original bombing strategy, where places like the Beckton gasworks were hit, wasn't working. They were not going to soften Britain up for invasion by hitting militarily significant targets. The pilots of the Battle of Britain were protecting Britain's industries and transport infrastructure and so on well enough so that he abandoned that idea. So idea number 2, this is the story. I don't know if it's true. He comes into Luftwaffe headquarters waving Baedeker's guidebook to England, which is the standard German language tourist guidebook to England. Yeah. And he says, I want you to destroy every target here that gets 3 stars.
Really?
The highest rank of significance. So the targeting strategy changes, and they go for the most famous, the most precious buildings. We're now trying to destroy British morale rather than destroy British industrial infrastructure and ability to fight. And one of the targets was St. Paul's. And night of the 29th, apparently over 1,000 planes were sent. Wow. And the result was, well, if you walk around St. Paul's now, particularly in the north, you won't find any buildings from before 1940 except for St. Paul's. And that goes on. That's why the Barbican is where it is.
Really?
That night so obliterated that whole stretch of London that the authorities decided they weren't going to try to rebuild. They would actually invent a new model of urban planning, and I have a whole podcast episode about that. Yeah.
Side street. Listen.
3 bombs hit the cathedral itself. The one that hit the dome didn't go off, and it took them a couple weeks to get it down. Yeah. So there was an unexploded bomb over the heads of people attending church services.
Your face.
But if you go in and you walk down to the altar end, you can see quite obviously that the area around the high altar has been rebuilt, because that was pretty much completely destroyed. And also a bomb hit the entrance, but the damage was not quite so bad. There's a famous photograph, which maybe everybody knows, of the dome of St. Paul's rising out of the smoke of the 29th of December, apparently untouched. It's a great emblem of British resistance. If they'd taken it from the other side, you would have seen the hole where the second bomb went through.
That's interesting. So I'd heard that the reason he changed his tact was because we dropped a bomb almost accidentally on a German city. I can't remember which one it was. And then he got really angry and decided to return the favour. Is that a myth?
No, that's not a myth, but that's another change of strategy.
Yeah.
And the city he chose to obliterate in return for, I want to say Hamburg was hit.
I think it was Hamburg. I think is right.
was Coventry. And if you go to Coventry, again, it's like visiting the Barbican. The center of Coventry is just not there.
Yeah, that is. I actually didn't know it was that bad on the 29th. So was there any other really historical buildings that got hit on that night?
Yeah. Again, we're straying into what might be urban myth at this point.
It's more interesting.
One of the targets was Buckingham Palace, and only one of the planes that was given Buckingham Palace as its target got there.
Really?
And by then, it was so badly damaged that the pilot knew he wasn't going to get back. So he apparently flew down the Mall toward Buckingham Palace.
Kamikaze.
Yeah, and he's just going to fly into the building. And an RAF pilot realized what was happening and dived on him, and the wreckage of the two planes landed in the courtyard in front of the palace.
So an RAF pilot sacrificed himself to say, "Oh my!"
Now I don't know when I'm straying into urban myth here, but the continuation of the story is that the pilot was given the Iron Cross with umpteen oak leaves, and the pilot was given the VC posthumously, which you're not supposed to be able to get because at some point I may be making it up.
We'll have to try and find out if that's
whoever
true.
told me made that up.
That's probably my favorite.
But the Palace of Westminster, Houses of Parliament were just about completely destroyed. So what you look at now is a 1950s reconstruction of an 1850s building that's trying to look like it was built in the 1450s. Yeah, it's... and you asked what of London is untouched? Yeah. Well, that's probably the most touched place in town. Churchill, when the palace was hit, Churchill was called out of his bunker, which is now a museum under the Foreign Office, and was brought down to look at the wreckage. And the fire service said they could either save the House of Commons chamber or they could save Westminster Hall, which goes back to 1100 approximately. And Churchill chose to sacrifice the House of Commons and save the medieval building.
Yeah.
So if you go to see Parliament now, you're sitting in something that's basically 1950s.
I didn't know that either. Also, so I've kind of tied myself in a bit of a knot with the podcast. I've said it's about either sport, wildlife, psychology, and I think business are the four areas. Now, so just for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to tell people that you used to be an NBA player. Okay?
You can tell them. It wouldn't be true. It would be deeply unlikely. But we can do. What do I have to talk about? Sport?
Yeah, go on. Do you play any sport? Yeah, you pick any business, psychology.
Well, I can't. No, I am not a sportsman. Chess is my game. If it counts as a sport, I was once a mediocre chess player.
That'll do. You're in. Do you think London is the most interesting city in the world?
Well, if you're a chess player, of course, because the first World's Chess Championship was played here in Simpsons on the Strand, the restaurant by the Savoy. And it's closed at the moment, but apparently they're reopening it. You go in, you can see the boards that were used. They're decorating the walls. So
that's pretty cool.
That was 1850s, I think. That's right.
Because you know so much about London.
Yeah, well, I'm still a tourist, right? I've been here for 40-something years, and I'm still walking around going, oh, wow.
So just to finalize, say someone was coming over to London and you've got all the tourist stuff. Let's assume they've got that on their list. If you had to recommend an area just to walk around, which part would you send them to?
Ooh, no, you didn't prepare me for that
I
question.
didn't. I want raw Alan.
That's an interesting one.
Give me a couple if you're not tied to one.
If they have a Sunday, walking around the city of London on a Sunday when there's nobody else here is very interesting. You're not interrupting the traffic flow. You can pause and stare and consult your guidebook or whatever it is you're using to help out. So that's the historic center. That's walking along the river is something that does not get done enough. The towpaths are
Which side would you say?
Colonized by joggers these days. In most places, we call it the North Bank, even though the river does a left turn. It's not always the North Bank. The North Bank is more developed. So Wapping High Street is a treat.
Somewhere towards when you
starting at Hammersmith and walking west to Chiswick. That's a really nice walk. Coming all the way out to Richmond and walking to Twickenham. As an American, I still haven't gotten over the fact that in this country you can walk from one town to the next. It's really unusual not to be able to walk from one town to the next. If you try to do that in the U.S., you get shot. You cross somebody's private property and they gun you down. So I still regard that as a joyous experience. Whitecross Street, I did four episodes this year about Whitecross Street, which runs from the Barbican north to Old Street.
Okay.
And there's a street market, and there are sites of old theaters, and you're walking through the whole history of urban housing. As you walk through, there are graveyards galore, and I love a good graveyard.
Where's that really old graveyard where it's all really tight?
I can't remember. Which one do you want?
You walk through it and it's all like this. You honestly feel like you're in some kind of fairy tale book. Where is that?
Is this Bunhill Fields you're talking about?
Must be. It's like really tight on a street, and you can walk through it to another.
Yeah, that's Bunhill Fields.
Bunhill Field. That was
which was originally Bonehill Fields. It's just off Whitecross Street. And
where's that?
It's north of the city.
Okay.
Between Dalston High Road and Old Street, in that sort of, and that's where radical Protestants got buried because Anglican clergymen wouldn't let them into Anglican churchyards because they weren't Anglican. So they were stuck out there. So Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, is buried there. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, is there. William Blake, one of my hero of heroes, the poet, author of Jerusalem, Will Build Jerusalem in England's Green and Pleasant Land. He is there.
Really? I might go there again.
And if you know where to look, you get a really extraordinary moment there. The Quakers were so weird that they weren't even allowed into Bunhill Fields.
Oh, really?
Even other nonconformists wouldn't let them in. So they have a separate burial ground about 100 yards away from Bunhill Fields. It's completely surrounded by a post-war housing estate now. So you have to sort of walk past people's dumpsters and stuff, and then you're in the middle of this Quaker burying ground where the founder of the Quakers, George Fox, one of the greatest men in British history, where he is buried.
And I've given you a little bit of time to simmer on this one.
Okay.
If you go back and observe one day in history, what would you do?
Well, if I'm not a brave man.
You're not a participant.
If you're allowing me to be a coward and not put myself at risk. The 29th of December, 1940 would be really interesting.
Just to watch it,
wouldn't it? The first night of the Great Fire, September
you sit on Pudding Lane and see what actually happened.
1666. Yeah, it would be nice to, I guess, to witness that. The arrival of William and Mary, the so-called Glorious Revolution in 1688, were they really welcomed? Or what was the crowd like on that day? That would be interesting. The execution of Charles I would be interesting. If I'm not in danger, the peasants' revolt would be interesting. The plague. Oh, yes. Take me back to the Black Death.
Well, just dark things you want to observe.
Well, because, but there's an important truth behind that. If you ask about single events, the single events will tend to be disasters.
Yeah.
What history is continuity punctuated by chaos. So you've asked about punctuation marks, and they will tend to be chaotic.
That's interesting.
But, there will have been days, weeks, months, decades where life is going on as normal. And that would be really interesting,
just
too.
a general day.
What's it like to be an everyday Londoner in, I don't know, 1636?
Yeah.
As far as I know, nothing interesting happened in 1636. So, hey, I can see how ordinary people lived ordinary lives. That would be worth doing.
Yeah, I'd be very keen to see the Battle of Hastings play out. Was that one day, though? Maybe longer than one day?
No.
All in one day?
One afternoon.
That would be quite, because you only see the French side of that, right? Or the Norman side.
All our sources are Norman. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And I guess the gunpowder plot would be interesting to see as well.
See, you're into the dark stuff.
Yeah. Well, when you mention it,
that's something that didn't go off, right?
Yeah.
So there wouldn't be much to see.
I guess I'd like to be in there, see him pop in and get caught, and then what happened after. But I think you're right. You think of it, there aren't many joyous moments that are big moments.
Coronations. Yeah. I'm just not. I'm not into the royal family enough to want to go. If you're giving me only one option, a coronation,
Okay, and
I'm
the
not
next
that
one,
excited.
If you could sit and have a meal with one person from history.
Gosh. In their own time or in mine?
What would you prefer?
I don't know.
Okay, let's say you can go back to their time, have a chat with them. They understand where you're from. You just get to sit with them, ask them questions.
Can I have William Morris?
You can, if you explain to me who that is.
Gee, that's shocking.
I'm sorry.
William Morris was a painter, a poet, a translator, an architect, a pioneer interior decorator, a pioneer socialist, and a pioneer of open marriage. It seems to me there's so much to talk about there. And if you know Morris wallpaper, we don't have any Morris wallpaper. Wallpaper with vines coming down the wall. That's his style. He sort of pioneered a kind of arts and crafts style in the late 19th century. Had a reputation as a great talker. Also had a reputation for being short. And unlike you, I'm a person of civilized size. I wouldn't be looking up at him the way I'm looking up at you.
Yeah.
So that might be my choice.
Perfect. Well, look, we've been going a little bit longer than we thought there.
Really? Okay.
So that was excellent, Alan.
Well, I'm glad.
Look, thank you so much for your time. And
not at all.
As we've mentioned already, Alan has a podcast. Side Streets, do you want to plug it at all?
Yes, it's called Side Streets. We have a little website, sidestreets.co.uk, or you can find it on all those usual podcast places. We're We do one episode a month. It's just my voice, but not for as long as this. Our target length is 20 minutes, and that's usually what we hit. We're in the second year now, so I think there are 20 episodes waiting for anybody that wants to go and hear some more of my stories.
Yeah, if you like the history of London, it's the one to listen to. Lovely. Alan, thank you.
You're welcome, Ross. Pleasure to be here.